This is a continuation of the previous screencast, which looked at adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short, its role, its structure, and an introduction to the three energy systems, where the ATP-PC system was covered in more depth. The purpose of this screencast is solely to go through the lactic acid system, and I will create another screencast which will look at the aerobic system in more detail as well. If you can recall from the previous screencast that there were the three energy systems that were highlighted, two of them were anaerobic and one was aerobic. The two anaerobic energy systems are the ATP-PC system and the lactic acid system, and what that means, just to recall, is that both those energy systems are able to work in the absence of sufficient oxygen. And in introducing a question in either energy system, the ATP-PC or the lactic acid, if you need to state that it is an anaerobic energy system, and you'll gain a mark for that. Now, as the name suggests, the lactic acid system is an energy system which will produce lactic acid, and lactic acid is that mild poison which is released in the muscle cell when there isn't sufficient oxygen during intense exercise, and it will cause that burning sensation, which is quite well conveyed in this little picture, where a runner, maybe a 400 meter, 800 meter runner, throughout their race will start to feel a very, very heavy or burning sensation in their legs, and that's due to the buildup of lactic acid. And too much lactic acid can then cause or induce muscle fatigue. Okay, so if you can remember that in the ATP-PC system, the primary fuel which is broken down to create energy, to resynthesize ADP into ATP, was phosphocreatine, which was broken down by the enzyme creatine kinase. Now, the difference, one of the main differences between the ATP-PC system and the lactic acid system is that the primary fuel that's broken down by the lactic acid system is glucose. And remember that anytime you talk about energy being created, you have to say that, in this example, the lactic acid system will break down glucose to provide energy via coupled reactions. Okay, that's that key term that we looked at before, and that is when the product from one reaction is used in another reaction, in this case energy, and this energy is then used to resynthesize ADP back into ATP. So where does this glucose that we need to provide energy for the lactic acid system come from? Glucose will come from, it'll be supplied directly from the digestion of carbohydrates or from glycogen, and glycogen is an excessive store of glucose that is stored in the muscles and liver and is readily available as an energy fuel. You'll remember that when we looked at the ATP-PC system, one of the main disadvantages of that energy system is that its fuel, phosphocreatine, the stores are limited in the muscle cell, and therefore they can deplete quite quickly. So when an athlete starts to exercise within the ATP-PC system, and these stores of PC begin to reduce and deplete, this will then activate the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase, and that's a new enzyme that you need to be aware of in this system. And the role of glycogen phosphorylase is to break down the glycogen stores within our muscles and liver into glucose, which is then further broken down in a series of reactions called glycolysis. It's worth noting at this stage that anytime you are answering an exam question on energy systems, always ask yourself, where are the reactions within this energy system taking place in the cell? So where specifically within the cell is all of this happening? And just like the ATP-PC system, the reaction of glycolysis will also happen in the muscle cell sarcoplasm. And this is key, and you need to mention it when introducing or when talking about either energy system. This now leads us on to anaerobic glycolysis, and as I've already alluded to, the word anaerobic means that the reaction or the energy system does not require oxygen in order for it to function. Anaerobic glycolysis can be defined as the partial, incomplete breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid, and this will make much more sense when we look through the diagram and we explain each of the stages in more detail. Here we have a detailed diagram which highlights all of the stages involved in anaerobic glycolysis. If we draw our attention firstly to the side here, the first thing that we should notice is where it takes place, and again it takes place in the muscle sarcoplasm of the cell. The first stage in this process is that when the glycogen that's stored in the muscle and the liver is broken down by the enzyme glycogen phosphorylase, which is, of course, stimulated or activated by the decrease in phosphocreatine stores. The second stage of this process involves the enzyme phosphofructokinase, which is involved in initiating the partial breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid. As this process is anaerobic, we know that it will take place in the absence of sufficient oxygen, and because of this, the pyruvic acid that is produced will then be further broken down into lactic acid by the enzyme which is known as lactate dehydrogenase. And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that within this diagram, PFK and LDH are both abbreviated, but again, as I've said before, always name the full enzyme, spell it correctly, and then use the abbreviation in brackets. And for the remainder of that question, you can refer to it as PFK or LDH. And finally, the last thing that we need to draw our attention to within this diagram is the product of this reaction, which of course is energy. And because energy is released in this reaction, it is known as an exothermic reaction. And as you can see here, in anaerobic glycolysis, the opposite to ATP-PC system, which only produces 1 mole of ATP. In anaerobic glycolysis, 2 molecules of ATP can be produced per 1 mole of glucose. And remember, just like the ATP-PC system, where 1 mole of ATP can be produced from 1 molecule of phosphocreatine, the energy that's released from anaerobic glycolysis in the lactic acid system is not used for muscular work, but the energy that's produced is used to resynthesize ADP back into ATP via a coupled reaction. Before moving on to the advantages and disadvantages of this energy system, it's important that we note some key aspects of the energy system. First point to make is that although the lactic acid system is slightly more complex and slower than the ATP-PC system, it still is a relatively quick process because it doesn't require oxygen. And also because the glycogen and glucose is readily available in the cells, and for this reason it is a quick process, and the reactions can take place quite quickly. Another important aspect of the lactic acid system is that it will only provide energy to resynthesize ATP during the first 2 up to about 3 minutes of high intensity, short duration anaerobic activity. Anything after 3 minutes and you're probably going to be going into your aerobic system, so that because your body cannot exercise within that energy system for much longer due to the buildup of lactic acid. So if you remember from the ATP-PC system, this energy system will only function up to about 10 seconds, whereas the lactic acid system can maybe last up to about 2 or 3 minutes of high intensity activity. So that might be an 800 meter, maybe potentially up to a 1500 meter run. Although the lactic acid system has the potential to provide energy for up to 3 minutes of high intensity exercise, if the exercise that is taking place is flat out to exhaustion, so if you went outside to a 400 meter track and you sprinted as hard as you could, flat out to exhaustion, in this situation the lactic acid system may only be able to last up to 30 seconds. It's only when the intensity is lowered slightly, where it's still high intensity but it's not flat out to exhaustion, that it's only when you lower this intensity a little bit that it can last up to about 3 minutes, and that's worth noting. The main limitation of the lactic acid system is due to the onset of blood lactate accumulation, which is also referred to as OBLA for short. As the lactic acid accumulates due to the absence of oxygen in the lactic acid system, this will cause a decreased pH or an increased acidity in the muscle cells, and what this will do is it will inhibit the enzymes which are involved in glycolysis, like PFK and glycogen phosphorylase. And because of these enzymes being inhibited, this will induce muscle fatigue. The lactic acid system can be applied to many practical contexts, and one of the main examples, or one of the best examples that's given, is a 400 meter sprint, as this is the event where the lactic acid system will be predominantly used in order to provide energy to resynthesize ATP. Another example or practical example would be for many midfield team games players, whether that's in soccer or if someone plays in midfield in Gaelic football, or in any game which requires you to cover a lot of the playing pitch, where you may have to repeatedly sprint up and down areas of the pitch in order to be effective at your position. This is a video of a very good example of when the lactic acid system will be predominantly used within tennis. Both Andy Murray and Novak Djokovic take part in a rally which lasts for maybe over a minute, and both are having to sprint from along the baseline in order to return shots. So not only the running, but also the force that they have to use to return shots within this is very, very high intensity and short duration, because it only lasts maybe up to a minute. But for tennis, it's quite long. So this is a good example of when the lactic acid system would really kick in, and the players would certainly, or the tennis players would certainly be feeling a buildup of lactic acid following this rally.
It's getting good now. Wow. Djokovic came in, he was completely out of breath when he...
So you'll notice from this video that both players are obviously working at a very, very high intensity, and especially Novak Djokovic, who seems to have to cover more of the court than Andy Murray. And you can see afterwards both players are beginning to breathe heavily, and that's repaying the oxygen debt. And both would have felt a really, really large buildup of lactic acid in their muscles, which would have caused muscle fatigue. And both of them would not have been able to maintain that level of activity or tennis for much longer than what they did, because of the onset of blood lactate accumulation, which would have inhibited the enzymes involved in glycolysis and therefore induced muscle fatigue where they'd have to stop. And finally, we're just going to quickly go through the advantages and disadvantages of the lactic acid energy system, which you'll need to go over in some depth to make sure that you know in preparation for your exam, because they may well ask a question about critically evaluate each energy system in their function of producing energy to resynthesize ATP. And when the word critically evaluate comes up, you obviously need to talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So this is something that you really need to draw your attention to, as well as the training adaptations within your textbook. And I'll stress at this point as well that these screencasts are not to be used solely for revision. They are a assistance tool that, along with all of your other resources or your other revision tools, including your textbook, your notes, your worksheets, and anything else that I've given you. So, first advantages of the advantages of the lactic acid system is the large glycogen store in the muscle or liver is readily available as a potential energy source. So we talked about that, how the glycogen was built up due to carbohydrate intake and is stored in the liver and muscle, and it's there ready to be used relatively quickly. Not just as quick as PC and the ATP-PC system, but still relatively quick. The second advantage is that the lactic acid system will resynthesize 2 molecules of ATP. Now, although this doesn't seem like a lot, and it isn't much in comparison to the aerobic energy system, it still is more than the ATP-PC system, and therefore you can exercise for a little bit longer. Third advantage is the lactic acid system requires fewer reactions than the aerobic system, and therefore this provides a quicker supply of energy. And when we go through the aerobic energy system in a separate screencast, It's much more complex, and you'll appreciate that this is a big advantage of the lactic acid system. Fourth advantage is that glycogen phosphorylase and PFK enzyme, they're an activation due to a decrease in phosphocreatine. So when our body or when our PC stores within our cells decrease, this automatically stimulates the activation of both of these enzymes, allowing a quick transition in between energy systems. The fifth advantage of the lactic acid system is that it provides energy for high intensity exercise lasting between 10 and 180 seconds. So just after your ATP-PC system, which only goes up to 10 seconds, so between 10 seconds and 3 minutes, this energy system can provide energy. And finally, it can work aerobically and anaerobically. The disadvantages of the lactic acid system are it's not just as quick as the ATP-PC system. It produces lactic acid, which is a fatiguing byproduct. Okay, when we talk about onset of blood lactate accumulation and how that lactic acid can inhibit the enzymes which are involved in anaerobic glycolysis and therefore induce muscle fatigue. There will be an increased acidity, which reduces pH in the cell, and this is what inhibits the enzyme action. The lactic acid will also stimulate pain receptors, and that's when we get that burning sensation in our muscles. The pain receptors will be triggered off, and it'll be quite uncomfortable when you exercise for a long period of time, maximally in this energy system. And finally, the net effect is muscle fatigue and pain. Okay, so although the lactic acid system has many advantages, it is an energy system which can cause a lot of discomfort and can be quite painful during fatigue.